Jonbenet Ramsey, that is a name that certainly evokes a lot of imagery. She was so beautiful and innocent, that little girl. I think many of us remember her because she was a pageant star. That was odd for someone who was 6 years old. But those pictures, wow, did they endure. She was so brutally killed, too. And here we are 20 years later, and the mystery surrounding Jonbenet's death seems to grow, and it sure does endure as well. It was Christmas night, 1996. Jonbenet vanished from her beautiful home in Boulder, Colorado. It would be hours later that she was instead found dead in the basement. She'd been strangled. Someone killed Jonbenet Ramsey, but no one has been brought to justice. The next morning, as the family was planning to fly to Michigan for what they called a second Christmas, Jonbenet's mother, Patsy Ramsey, found a 3-page ransom note, she said. She found it on the steps in her house. Patsy says she ran upstairs. Jonbenet was not in her bed. And then Patsy made this chilling 911 call.
A note was left in your daughter's house. How old is your daughter? 6 years old. She's gone. 6 years old. How long ago was it? I don't know. I just have the note. And my daughter, does it say who took her? What? Does it say who took her? I don't know. There's a ransom note here. It's a ransom note? It says FBTC. Victory. Please.
So it's been 2 decades. And you might think there have been so many retrospective pieces. Everyone's hashing out the case again. But as it turns out, this case is gathering some brand new urgency because the Boulder police are actually planning brand new DNA tests on some very key evidence. And the focus is on the testing of Jonbenet's underwear and the long johns that she was wearing when they found her body. Bobby Brown is a private investigator on the Jonbenet case. He joins me live from Denver. Joseph Scott Morgan is a professor of forensics at Jacksonville State University. He joins me from Atlanta. And Dr. William Morrone is the medical examiner, forensic pathologist, and toxicologist. And he joins me live from Madison Heights, Michigan. Gentlemen, thank you all for taking the time to talk to me about this, because this case, as it turns out 20 years later, is still very much active. What possibly could new DNA tests reveal? The science existed back then. Has it refined itself so much more, Bobby Brown, that we could find a new result?
Obviously, I think that it would depend on the actual evidence that was collected. And that's the problem that herein lies, that the actual crime scene was so contaminated, and then the evidence had gone from police department to the district attorney's office and back. So there's a problem with contamination. There's a problem with legally with the chain of evidence. So unfortunately right now, other than what they are releasing, we really don't know what is available that can now be tested, and if in fact that could be of a benefit.
I want to ask you all, if I can, specific questions about some of the evidence that was so key in this case, specifically the blanket that she was found wrapped in. Joseph, the blanket seems to be critical. It came from her bedroom, and it came from the bed that was unmade next to a bed that was made. Why is there such significance to that particular blanket, in your opinion?
Well, you know, as with every forensic case, Ashleigh, the idea here is connectivity. If we look back to what Locard said over 100 years ago, every contact leaves a trace. And this idea is that whose hands did this thing pass through? And this is compelling relative to this idea of putting an individual in the location with this little girl in her room, if she had been in her room, and then the blanket and her being found in the same location together in this kind of sequestered area in this massive house down in the basement. Where essentially nothing could be heard, nothing could be seen. They didn't find the body for an extended period of time, but yet this blanket is there with the body.
So, Dr. Morrone, let me ask you a little bit about the forensic injuries to Jonbenet. People know by now that she had quite a significant skull fracture. There was actually a hole in her skull. I'm not going to show you that picture, but I do have sort of a replica of what the injury looked like. We're showing that to the audience right now. There's been a lot of talk that the hole and the formation, the placement of where that is, matches up with a baton-like flashlight that was found in the home. Is there something to this injury that gives you a clue or drives you any closer to any particular suspects?
Well, if you look at how that appeared, when I look at a skull, and if I show you a skull this way, the fracture, the comminuted fracture with the depression, was on the right side. The only way you can have an injury on the right side, if somebody's facing you, is you either have to be left-handed or with the baton or with some linear object, you backhand the skull to create that. And the pattern is that the fracture runs the length. So that shows you that the blunt force trauma was not a round hammerhead. It was a baton-like object, like I held up an air freshener can. And the fact that the depression, we call it a comminuted fracture, was down into the brain, is part of the brain trauma below, shows that it was hard enough to crack it and depress it, and that created the bleed that was a subdural hematoma in the brain below where the fracture was.
I want to move on to another piece of evidence that people may not know about. It's a more obscure part of the case, but it was a pair of boots, Bobby, that were never found. What is the significance of the boots that are mysteriously gone?
Well, the significance would be Patsy reportedly owned a pair of beaver hair boots. On the night that this all occurred, Patsy, John, and Jonbenet, they had gone to a party, Christmas party at Fleet White's residence, and Patsy was wearing those beaver hair boots to that party. Obviously, when they went home, at some point, the boots were taken off. Whatever happened to them, it remains a question. However, under a piece of the duct tape, there was a hair that supposedly was identified by an FBI analysis, and that it was a beaver hair. So it would be extremely important to know if, in fact, that those boots, the boots that Patsy owned that had beaver hair, if, in fact, that hair was from her boots, and where are they?
And that is extraordinarily fascinating. I know that anybody who does a cross-examination would say, if you're wearing a pair of boots like that night, those hairs are all over the house and could easily have transferred. I could see both sides of that coin, which is part of the problem when it comes to this case. Everybody zeroes in on a particular part of evidence, and then sometimes to the exclusion of all else. And that's why the three of you are very, very valuable tonight. Because when Jonbenet's body was found, it was pretty obvious that that little 6-year-old had been tortured.
I took the duct tape off immediately and then tried to untie her hands, but the knot was way too tight. I couldn't get it loose, and I couldn't do anything but scream.
Gaviscon is a proven heartburn remedy that gives you fast-acting